Hi everybody, I wanted to take a moment to talk about what makes this day a very special day on the Jewish calendar, indeed on the world calendar. Today is Yud Beis Yud Gimel Tammuz, the 12th and the 13th of Tammuz. This is the day that was the birthday and the heroic liberation of perhaps the greatest Jewish hero of the 20th century. At a time when Judaism was facing the dual existential threats of the Holocaust and communist Russia, one man rose to stare down the communist regime, to stare down Nazi Germany, and ultimately to even stare the United States in the face and bend all three to his will. And that is Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, the Rebbe Rayatz, the sixth Chabad Rebbe, the predecessor to Rabbi Menachem Schneerson, our Rebbe. And his story does not begin, but to a certain degree reaches a truly dramatic inflection point in the year 1927. At this point, this is the height of the Stalinist regime and purges. The communist regime has subjugated an empire spanning 11 time zones into a state of abject fear and persecution, and had cowed every version of opposition. And nobody was standing up against this incredibly oppressive, brutal regime that ultimately killed nearly 30 million of its own citizens. In this communist regime, there was a particularly brutal office known as the Yevasetskia, which means the Jewish branch. This was made up of Jewish communists so committed to the party ideology that it was their goal to stamp out Judaism and to force everybody under the fold of communism by whatever means necessary. Arrests, executions, exiles, etc., through a network of spies and informers, the KGB, etc. Agents committed towards this effort, and in a very significant way they were successful. But one man stood in their way, and that was the Rebbe Rayatz, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who was at the center of a clandestine web that spanned the entirety of the USSR. We're talking all the way from the steppes of Siberia to Kiev and further Ukraine, the Baltic states, etc. And a network that included hundreds, thousands of yeshivas and mikvahs and shuls, etc., that were constantly on the move, operating in the underground. Cells of yeshiva students moving every few days or every few weeks from place to place. Rabbis, shochtim, moels, all being supported, organized, coordinated, and financed by the Rebbe Rayatz as the center of this web. The KGB were aware of him. He became public enemy number one, not metaphorically, quite actually. The Yevasetskia would print its enemies list on a yearly basis, and the Rebbe Rayatz was always at the top of this list. In fact, my personal story, my great-grandfather was sent off to Siberia and never came home, and the crime on his jacket was Agent Schneerson. That's all it took to send somebody off to Siberia. Hundreds of Hasidim perished in this effort to not just preserve Chabad Hasidism, but preserve Judaism. The previous Rebbe, the Rebbe Rayatz, sent his students to a certain degree to their death, knowing that this was what it was, sacrificing themselves on behalf of the millions of Jews in the Pale of Settlement. This comes to a head on Purim Katan in that year 1927. At this point, the pressure and the persecution had reached an untenable point. Everywhere the Rebbe Rayatz would travel, he would be followed by KGB agents, hounded. Everybody who he met, they were followed. He writes about this all incredibly poignantly in his diary. At this Farbrengen in 1927, in this underground room, he gathered with Hasidim in celebration of the Purim Katan, the small Purim. It's a leap year, and you add 2 months of Adar. The first month of Adar is the extra month, and Purim of that month ends up being what we call the small Purim, and the second month is the regular, the full-blown Purim. He was holding a Farbrengen commemorating the small Purim, gathered with his closest Hasidim, those that were willing to brave even attending such a gathering in defiance of the KGB. And the previous Rebbe tore open his his shirt and started pounding on his chest. And he says that I know that there are informers here, and everything that I am saying is going to go straight back to the KGB. But it must be said, hundreds of Hasidim have already been sacrificed, and hundreds of more will need to be. We must remain defiant. We must remain strong. We must win light over darkness. And as Purim was back then, where the Jewish people had to fight Amalek and to double down on their Jewish identity, so we need to do it today. And he spoke of this, knowing that this Farbrengen was going to cost him. Ultimately, this Farbrengen was the final nail, as it were, because while the KGB understood that the previous Rebbe, that the Rebbe Rayatz, was at the center of this network, he was very known to them, there was always the question whether it would be worth making a move against him, knowing that it would invite an international firestorm. And yet this Farbrengen was the thing that pushed it over the edge. And also the thought that in taking the previous Rebbe, they would not only bring him down, but they would bring down the whole network, because him being at the center of the network means all the entire paper trail and everything and all the documentation, the identity of all the people operating throughout the entire USSR would all be where the previous Rebbe was. And so it happened on the 15th of the month of Sivan at 2:30 in the morning. The KGB busted into his apartment, ransacked his apartment to, in a sense, collect all the files and all the papers as they were taking him away to the infamous Spalerno prison. As this ransacking was occurring, the previous Rebbe's newly engaged son-in-law, in other words, his second daughter, Chaya Mushka, was then newly engaged to Menachem Schneerson, a fourth cousin, which is why they shared the same last names. Menachem Schneerson, who eventually would become his successor and our Rebbe, who was at 2:30 in the morning still running errands in these incredibly turbulent times on behalf of world Jewry. His fiancée, incredibly bravely, was sitting there on the while the ransacking was occurring, while the KGB agents, she was sitting there with, her hip on the windowsill, looking out to the street. And when she noticed that her fiancé, Menachem Schneerson, was turning the corner to come to the apartment, not knowing that the house was right then being ransacked by KGB agents, she called out and said, "Schneerson, we have guests." Imagine, again, the risk she was taking. But the Rebbe, her fiancé, heard and immediately made an about face and disappeared in the down the alley, which was key and crucial because the Rebbe was the Rebbe, because he was eventually he's the successor. At that time he wasn't the Rebbe; he was the incoming son-in-law of the Rebbe at that time, by our Rebbe. So that's why I refer to him as Rebbe. Let's say that Menachem Schneerson was then key in coordinating much of the international effort, the international pressure campaign. Ultimately, to the incredible chagrin of the KGB agents, not a single shred of paper could be found detailing names, contacts, coordination, timelines, locations, nothing, because it was all in the Rebbe Rayatz's head. He kept this entire network coordinated in his formidable mind. This added a tremendous amount of frustration, and they had to just suffice with taking the Rebbe himself in and subject him to imprisonment and obviously much interrogation, hoping to get the information in that fashion. He was taken away and brought to the Spalerno, or the Spalerka prison. This prison was infamous. It would at times execute hundreds of inmates a night. And we're not talking about, true criminals, murderers or terrorists, etc., etc. We're talking about people that their crimes were that they did not conform with the Bolshevik revolution. These were philosophers and writers and professors. The previous Rebbe writes about the entire period in which he was incarcerated in his diary, and he kept a very, very thorough diary, sharing pretty much not just the events of his life, but his feelings, etc. And this section of it is particularly compelling reading. His humanity comes out. He's truly a great hero, and to read this dramatic story from the hero's perspective, but to also hear as he struggles with his challenges, etc., etc., it's remarkable. And he referred to it in his diary as Tractate Hell, Masechet Gehenim, chapters 1, 2, and 3. He is brought into this prison as he was taken again at 2:30 in the morning. He obviously at that point had not put on tefillin. And as the hours had passed, etc., he realized that even as he's being taken for interrogation and his whole future is unbeknownst to him, but the first thing his concern was to make sure that he got a chance to daven. And so as they are leading him through the corridors of the prison to register him in, etc., in a sense, at a time of particular vulnerability, his mind is entirely on holy task, and he wraps the tefillin while he's being led by the agent. So the agent doesn't know this, but right behind him, the Frierdiker Rebbe is wrapping his tefillin and getting in the davening, because he knows later he would not have the opportunity. At one point or another, this agent turns around, sees the Frierdiker Rebbe in his house in tefillin, and in his rage throws him down a steep staircase, metal staircase. This becomes one of the many beatings, unfortunately, that the previous Rebbe suffered in this terrible, terrible place, to the point where at the end of his life he was paralyzed from the waist down as a result of the suffering that he incurred in this prison. As he's then being taken for further, and they obviously rip the tefillin off of him and confiscate his tefillin. He will subsequently engage in a multi-day hunger strike, demanding his rights. He says, that the law made it that you can't preach religion to the masses, but according to the rights, even as they stood at that time, the laws is that a person could choose to personally pray, etc., etc., and therefore there was no right by law of the time to withhold from him his tefillin, and he went on a hunger strike for the ability to have his tefillin daven. This was to him of paramount importance, his ability to continue serving God even in this terrible, terrible place. The two agents who had been assigned to his case, the ones who had built the case and were the ones who imprisoned him and were making the case against him, interrogating him throughout the entire process, two agents high up in the communist regime were heartbreakingly Jewish. They themselves were communist Jews, and so vehement that they took great pride. In fact, one of them's name was Lulav, and the other's name was Nachmanson. Nachmanson, at one point, with glee, shares with the Rebbe Rayatz, and says that your father, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, had Hasidim, a husband and wife they counted themselves among the Hasidim disciples of your father, and they couldn't have children, and they came to your father and they received the blessing, and the blessing worked, and they had a child, and that child is this Nachmanson who stands here and is going to be the one to bring you down. That's how vehement their commitment and allegiance to the Communist Party was. Truly, I could imagine on a psychological level where the previous Rebbe felt a sense of responsibility to every single Jewish soul. This hurt all the more so. Ultimately, as they are processing the previous Rebbe, and from that point forward, the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe Rayatz, took such a heroic stance and perspective in this entire process. He approached this whole experience with an iron will, almost like a royalty imprisoned. If anybody who interrogator spoke to him happened to be Jewish, he would only speak to them in Yiddish. He would not answer if they spoke to him in Russian. So you're Jewish and I'm Jewish, we're going to speak Yiddish to each other, and if I'm not going to respond to you, this is going to happen on my terms. When they asked him what was his name, he said, my name is Honored Citizen for All Generations, Rabbi Yosef Schneerson. That was a title given to the Schneerson family by the Tsar. And obviously the Tsar, as far as the Bolshevik revolutionists were concerned, was Treif. But it was a title that they carried, bequeathed to them by the Tsar for favors done for the admiration that the Tsar had for the Schneerson family. And the previous Rebbe looked him square in the eye and referred to himself by this moniker. We also know that during many of the various interrogations by the most brutal and adept interrogators of the KGB, one of them was getting so frustrated that he was not able to make any progress that he pulls out his revolver, slams it down on the table, pointed at the previous Rebbe, and says, "This toy makes everybody talk." To which the previous Rebbe looked at him calmly and said, "That toy can make anybody talk who has one world and many gods. And this weapon can threaten all of it. I have one God and two worlds. Your toy does not threaten me at all. Because my one God will stay with me, even if you use that toy and I have to traverse from this world to the next. You're no threat to me. There's nothing that you can do here that threatens me." And so over the course of these the weeks that he was imprisoned, with the beatings and the interrogations and the humiliations, the Rebbe Rayatz maintained this incredible sense of aplomb and transcendence that is truly inspiring to read about. At one point, they actually came to tell him that the sentence, his original sentence, had been reduced and then further reduced. The international pressure, and we say the divine intervention, was having an effect. Originally, the Rebbe Rayatz, one of the interrogations, his file was left open, perhaps on purpose, as a psychological warfare. But he saw that it was open to the page of where his sentence was written out on his file. At that point, by the way, you didn't have a name. They would dehumanize these prisoners. You were given a number, a yarlik, almost like the Nazis with their number of the tattoos. You didn't deserve to, you were subhuman at that point. You didn't deserve to have a name. And so he was given a number. And he sees his file open, and the sentence, that was the original sentence, was a sentence for death. But that was crossed out. Then it was 10 years hard labor in Siberia, which for a man of his age was basically a death sentence, and that was crossed out. Ultimately, they came to tell him, to share with him the new sentence, far lighter. But he was in the middle of davening. He had succeeded through his hunger strike to get back his talis and tefillin. Ultimately, to a certain degree, he would win each of these power struggles, these power plays between him and his jailers. The previous Rebbe really basically ended up having it his way, maintaining agency, even in this place where they were trying to break you as a person. And he was davening, and they came and said, "Stand up, prisoner 567, 32, whatever his yarlik number was." And he was in the middle of davening, so he ignored them. This they took as an insult, and they beat him bloody. He got up and continued davening. He came back a little while later to try again. "Stand up and listen to what we have to say." And he continued davening and ignored them. And they beat him again. The third time they came back, Lulav, the agent, the Jew, at this point, he himself kind of, his resolve was broken, and he turned to the previous Rebbe and he begged him. He says, "Please, we're here to tell you good news. Just be willing to listen." The previous Rebbe indicated to him, "I'm almost done." Finished davening. He says, "Now I'm ready to listen." And he said that your new sentence is 3 years exile to a town called Kostroma. Now, this, although it was part of the sentence, ultimately was the beginning of the redemption. It turns out that, by the way, this day is the 3rd of Tammuz, the day that many years in the future would be the day of his successor, our Rebbe's passing. But this day has been labeled the beginning of redemption, even though we sometimes don't see it. May it be so that for us as well, that the Rebbe's passing should not be an era of darkness, a gateway into darkness, but rather should be a gateway to the ultimate redemption. Back to the storyline. As a matter of, in a sense, further insult, and again, a further power play, the ticket to the imprisonment had to be paid by the prisoner. And the previous Rebbe said, "If that's the case, I'm paying for it first class. Traveling first class." Again, that sense of royalty. First class also allowed that when the previous Rebbe arrived at the platform for the train, that this was a larger section of the train, and allowed for thousands of his Hasidim who did not get a chance, or hundreds, who had not gotten a chance to see him since he was in prison, and many understood that would most likely be the death penalty. This was their chance to lay their eyes on their beloved Rebbe for the first time in weeks and weeks and weeks. And so the train yard was packed. And the previous Rebbe, they're surrounded by his jailers and KGB agents, stands up and he makes a speech about standing strong and standing in opposition. And he delivers a Hasidic discourse right there on the platform. Ultimately, on the 3rd of Tammuz, he is taken on the train to this town of Kostroma. 10 days later, the political winds and the again divine support had shifted so dramatically that not only was it his date that he earned his liberation, or did he achieve liberation on that day, but because which happened to be on the 12th of Tammuz, that was the day that the news came in that he was being freed. But remarkably, it was his birthday, his Hebrew birthday. And that's only the day that his spirit is at its strongest. But what ended up happening is it also coincided with a clerical day of the kind of the secular communist regime, which means that paperwork could not be properly filed, and they were not able to free him on that day. And so they asked him to please sign an affidavit that he does not hold them responsible for not freeing him on that exact day. It's not their fault; they couldn't do it. There's not to be able to file the paperwork until the next day. So please let it be known that he does not hold them accountable. How the tides had turned. And ultimately, the previous Rebbe was freed the next day, the 13th of Tammuz, which is why we celebrate both the 12th and the 13th of Tammuz, and the day that the previous Rebbe, in his face-off with the communist, with the communist regime at the height of its power, the communists blinked first, and the previous Rebbe was ultimately freed. But he was considered too much the political hot potato, and so they said you can no longer stay in Russia, and he was moved to the Baltic states and Poland, spending time in Latvia, spending time in Warsaw, Poland. There, he reestablished the yeshiva and continued efforts inside Russia, coordinating efforts inside Russia, while moving his main base of operations to Riga and then to Warsaw. Ultimately, that is where the Rebbe, our Rebbe, his successor, married the previous Rebbe's daughter, and then eventually the Rebbe and his wife settled for about 10 or so years, give or take, in France. That's its own story. But in the meantime, the previous Rebbe is in this area, and you would think that with all the high drama and everything he would have earned a reprieve. But that is not the case. The previous Rebbe was in Warsaw, Poland, infamously on the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, as the Blitzkrieg broke out. And these details that we now know further are not from the previous Rebbe's own diary as much as it is from a collection of incredible letters, telegrams, missives that went between the U.S. State Department that was actively working on extracting the previous Rebbe from the hell of Nazi-controlled Europe. And in this effort, they partnered and collaborated with German military intelligence, all the way up to Admiral Canaris himself, a name that is familiar as being one of those who was a brilliant German strategist, head of the military intelligence, and old school, and actually had incredible disdain for Hitler and his takeover of the country, the direction he was in. Ultimately, was part of a plot to assassinate Hitler called Operation Valkyrie, and was eventually executed by Hitler as he purged the rank and file of all those that were not truly loyal to him and operating against him. And one of the things that Admiral Canaris was actively operating against the interests of the Führer, Hitler, Yimach Shammai, was aiding and abetting and helping coordinate the passage of the previous Rebbe through Nazi Germany, right through Berlin, ultimately to a place where he would eventually be able to go from there and emigrate to the United States. It's a remarkable story. The details of it are truly dramatic in a way it's hard to fathom. The previous Rebbe was leading the services on Kol Nidre night in a building in Warsaw, Poland. When that building was hit by a Nazi bomb, the entire building collapses down onto where the services are in the basement, where the previous Rebbe is holding services. The previous Rebbe escapes with all this Chassidim and out of the rubble, and they move to the next building and continue the services. This is a man of incredible strength. Ultimately, 4 German officers, all with either affinity or descended distantly from Jewish stock, have been recruited on this mission to subvert their own government and take the previous Rebbe and his family, the Schneerson family, through Nazi Germany in the back of a German military jeep, a covered jeep, in which they were hidden. The name of the main officer who was coordinating this was Major Max Bloch, or Bloch. And at various points, him being a major, that rank itself helped ease the passage. But there was times where the SS officer, an SS officer, would stop them, and even though Max Bloch outranked this officer, but the SS always in general felt that they were above the typical rank and file of the military, something that obviously led to much. They were more political animals than they were actual military. It was itself part of the drama that was occurring in the German army and the German military. And so this SS officer says, open the back of the truck, we're inspecting the contents. Perhaps they had heard something, rumors of something. And Bloch says, how dare you? I'm a major and I'm saying, let us pass unmolested. And it was basically a standoff to the point where weapons were drawn against each other. In the end, the SS officer backed off, and the truck was allowed to pass unmolested. Ultimately, in many stories, And we have this with, there's a book called Out of the Inferno, in which you can get a sense as to the drama that occurred just based on the various correspondences going back and forth between the United States, power lawyers in Manhattan, to the State Department, from the State Department to their counterparts throughout Europe, in Germany, German military intelligence, and other nations' diplomatic channels. Really fascinating. There's no narrative in this book. It's just all the correspondence in kind of chronological order that help give you the broader picture of this massive international effort to get the previous Rebbe and his family out of Europe and over to the United States. Eventually, in the twilight of his life, the previous Rebbe arrives in the United States. And you would think, in the final 10 years of his life, he's now pretty much a broken person in his body. He has to be taken off the boat, the USS Drottningholm, on Pier 94, Pier 94, in a wheelchair, because he is at that point broken physically. And now he's facing a whole new animal, a country that will smother you with love, where Jews that had defied the communists and the Nazis to maintain their identity and their survival arrived in the United States only at that point to assimilate and lose their identity, not because they were being forced to, but because they were being welcomed to. In fact, when the previous Rebbe arrived in the United States, he was looking out on a sea of Hasidim who had come to greet him. But not a single one of them had a beard. They were all modern American Hasidim, because America is different. Over here, you're allowed to be Jewish, you're also allowed to not be Jewish. And everybody works on Shabbos. It's not because it's a persecution or anything against Judaism in particular. It's because we all serve at the altar of the almighty dollar. And if you don't work on Saturday, you don't have a job come Monday. And so this is what greets him. A land of bounty and the golden Medina, but a spiritual wasteland. And even his own Hasidim come and tell him, Rebbe, America is anders. America is different. Don't expect to have what you had in the old country in terms of yeshivas and kosher and all these things. This is America. We get to live, but we live the American way. And the previous Rebbe took one look at America and said, America is nicht anders. Let me make a declaration. America is no different. And by the time I'm done with America, there's going to be more yeshivas here than there ever was in the old country. You're going to be able to not only get kosher, but Chalav Yisrael in Kentucky. And this will become one of the greatest centers of Jewish identity and learning and practice in history. And he immediately rolled up his sleeves and he got busy. And he did not stop until the last day of his life. This is the story of the Rebbe Rayatz. Epilogue. The Rebbe Rayatz passed in the year 1950 on the 10th of Shvat. He was shown incredible honor and respect by the United States. In fact, they came to him, to his office, to naturalize him as a citizen, which gives truth to the statement of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs when he said that in his experience of being the nexus of religiosity in the secular world in the way that he uniquely was, that Gentiles respect Jews who respect their Judaism. You don't have to walk away from your Judaism. In fact, you should not walk away from your Judaism to earn the respect of the world, of the Gentile world around you. Rather, be a proud, practicing, identifiable, committed Jew, and you will earn their respect in that. And the previous Rebbe is a shining example of a man who, wherever he was, if it was in communist Russia, and in a prison, if it was in Nazi Germany, or if it was in the roaring years of the United States, never compromised ever on any of his ideals, and he changed the face of this world, because now, in fact, you can get Chalav Yisrael in Kentucky, and you have more yeshivas in the United States than you ever had in Poland and in Russia and in Ukraine, etc. And he is the one who founded the outreach movement. We know the Chabad Shluchim. The first Shluchim were not sent by our Rebbe, were actually sent by the previous Rebbe. The Rebbe took it and expanded it exponentially. But this one man, one could make an argument, was the greatest Jewish hero of the 20th century. And today is the day of his heroic liberation. So say l'chaim, think about what it is that you might be able to do to, in a sense, live up to the theme of this day, of standing in defiance, strong, proud as a Jew, and liberated. Help another Jew do a mitzvah, help another Jew follow your example of being a proud Jew. Stand for what you believe in. Make the Rebbe Rayatz proud. Mazel Tov and Binyan Tov.